Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. Most of the stories we tell on this channel are warnings. A man arrives somewhere hoping things will be different, and they are. Just not in the way he planned. He loses money. He loses time. Sometimes he loses a bit of himself he doesn't get back. That's the shape of most of these stories, and we tell them because they're true, and because someone out there needs to hear them before they make the same mistakes. This one is also a warning, just a different kind. Brendan is 63 years old. He's from Limerick, in the west of Ireland. He spent 31 years working on the floor of a pharmaceutical packaging plant, and he is, by his own description, not a particularly interesting man. He'll tell you that himself. He's not being falsely modest. He's just accurate. But something happened to Brendan. Something that could have gone very badly, and didn't. And the reason it didn't, the specific, practical, unglamorous reason, is what we're here to talk about today. This one's going to stick with you. Not because it's dramatic, because it isn't. Here's his story, in his own words. Right. So, I'm not great at this sort of thing. Talking about myself. Never really saw the point of it. I spent 31 years on a factory floor where the less you said, generally speaking, the better everyone got on. You learned your job, you did it, you went home. I was good at that part. The plant was outside Limerick, pharmaceutical packaging, which sounds more interesting than it is. We packaged things, pills mostly, into boxes, into blister packs, onto pallets. Same line, same shift. A same walk-in from the car park every morning for 3 decades. The fluorescent lights had a flicker on the third one from the left for about 6 years before anyone fixed it. I used to time my walk to step past it quickly. Little things like that. You notice them when you're somewhere long enough. I wasn't miserable there. I want to say that plainly because I think people assume if you spent your life doing something like that, you must have been. But I wasn't. I was, I don't know, present, doing what needed doing. That was enough for me, or I thought it was. My wife, my ex-wife, I should say, she worked in a solicitor's office in town. We met young, got married young, bought a small house, had our daughter. The usual run of things, 26 years, not unhappy years, not particularly, just years. And then she left me for the man 3 doors down. His name was Paul. I'm not going to say his surname. He had a red car I always thought was a bit much for the road we lived on. We'd been over for dinner once, maybe twice. I'd lent him a socket wrench in 2019. I never got it back. That bothered me, actually. Still does, if I'm honest with you. The marriage ending I could process. The socket wrench. I don't know. There was something about the socket wrench. I didn't find out the way you might expect. There was no confrontation, no dramatic discovery. She just told me. Sat me down one evening and told me. Very calm about it. Said she'd been unhappy for a while and she was sorry and she was moving out within the month. I sat there and I think I said something like, right, okay. Because what else do you say to that? What's the speech you give? I didn't tell anyone. Didn't have to. We lived on a street where everyone knew everyone's business anyway. And this was, well, this was the kind of thing that travels. By Thursday of that week, I could tell by the way people spoke to me in the Centra that they knew. That particular kind of careful cheerfulness people put on when they feel sorry for you, but don't want to say so. I'm very familiar with that expression now. I could draw it from memory. The thing about being that man, the man whose wife left him for the neighbor, in a town like Limerick, is that it follows you. Not cruelly. Nobody was cruel. But it was always there, just underneath the surface of every conversation. You could feel them trying not to think about it while they were talking to you, which meant you were always thinking about it. But I went back to work. Clocked in, clocked out. Then the plant announced a restructuring. They were automating part of the line. Of course they were, they'd been talking about it for years, and they offered a redundancy package to anyone who wanted to take it. I was 17 months from my full pension date. Taking the package meant leaving a bit earlier than planned, and losing a small portion of the top-up I'd have gotten otherwise. Not enormous. A few €1,000 over the lifetime of the pension, maybe. I did the calculation on a Tuesday afternoon, and by Wednesday morning, I'd said yes. The timing was, as I told my daughter at the time, convenient. So suddenly, I was 62, retired, living alone in a 2-bedroom house in Limerick that felt roughly twice as large as it needed to be. I had my pension coming in. I had €92,000 in a post office savings account I'd barely touched in 10 years. I'm not a big spender, never was. The money just sat there accumulating because I never got around to doing anything with it. And I had a reputation in the town that I hadn't earned and couldn't shake. I wasn't depressed. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't falling apart. I was just hollow, I suppose, is the word. Not dramatically hollow. Quietly hollow. Going through the days in the right order, but not particularly invested in any of them. I started watching things on YouTube at night. Documentaries, mostly. History, nature, that kind of thing. And at some point, I genuinely couldn't tell you exactly when, the algorithm started showing me things about living abroad, retirement abroad, someone visiting Vietnam, someone retiring in Portugal, someone who'd moved to the Philippines and was doing a walkthrough of their apartment. I watched it. Then another one. Then another. I told myself I was just watching. The way you tell yourself you're just browsing when you're in a shop you can't afford. It was 1:30 on a Tuesday morning when I found the forum. The forum was called something straightforward. Expats in the Philippines, or Philippines expat life, something like that. I bookmarked it and didn't post anything. Just read. That was, I think, the most important decision I made in this entire business. Before the flights, before Cebu, before May, the most important thing I did was sit in my kitchen in Limerick for 4 months and read other people's stories before I opened my mouth or spent a single euro. I want to explain what that reading was actually like, not because I think people imagine it as research in some dry, academic sense. It wasn't. It was more like, you know when you're doing a quality check at the end of a production line and you're looking for defects? After a while, you stop thinking about it consciously. You just see them. That's what 4 months of reading those forums did for me. I started to see the shapes of things. The horror stories were easy to find. They weren't buried. The men who posted them seemed almost relieved to be telling someone, and there were a lot of them. There was a man from Yorkshire who'd built a house on his girlfriend's family's land, spent 2.8 million pesos, which is roughly €45,000. And when the relationship ended, the house stayed, because legally it had to. The land wasn't his. The house wasn't his. Nothing was his. He posted a photograph of it. Nice house, actually. He put a little Filipino flag emoji at the end of his post. I think that was meant to be ironic. There were the allowance stories. Men sending 25,000 pesos a month, about €400, which seemed perfectly reasonable until you saw how it grew. First, it was 25,000 pesos for her rent and food. Then 30,000 pesos when her mother got sick. Then 35,000 pesos because a sister needed school fees. Then the brother needed a motorcycle for work, 120,000 pesos, roughly 1,900 euros. Just a loan, he'd pay it back. He never paid it back. Nobody ever paid it back. The figure crept upward like rising water, and the men kept adjusting rather than stopping, because by the time they noticed they were already in past their knees. And the multiple boyfriend situation. I read about that more than once. Women maintaining 2, 3, sometimes 4 foreign men simultaneously, each one believing he was the only one, each one sending money monthly via Remitly or Western Union, none of them ever comparing notes, because why would they? One man found out when another man messaged him on Facebook. Turned out they'd both been sending money to the same woman in Cebu for 14 months. They'd never met. They were from different countries. The woman had photographs of both of them on her Facebook, in separate albums, neither set visible to the other. That level of organization, I thought. That's not amateur work. I read all of it. I read it carefully, the way I used to read the compliance documents at the plant. Not looking for loopholes, just trying to understand where the failures happened. But here's the thing, and I want to be clear about this because I don't think people talk about it enough. The forum wasn't only horror stories. Those got the most comments, the most engagement, the most fire emoji reactions. But if you scrolled far enough, and I had a lot of evenings to fill, you found the other posts, the quiet ones. A man from Canada who'd been in Dumaguete for 4 years, married, happy, posts occasionally about where to get a decent cup of coffee near the boulevard. A Dutch fella in Cebu who'd started a small online business and was getting on fine. A retired teacher from Galway, of all places, who'd written a long measured post about what had worked for him and what hadn't. And it wasn't sensational at all. It was just honest, practical. He listed the mistakes he'd nearly made and how he'd avoided them. That post I read twice. After about 3 months of this, I started keeping notes, actual written notes, in a small notebook I found in the kitchen drawer. Things like, don't put money in her name, even for a car. Don't start sending money before you've met in person. Don't mistake gratitude for love. They can coexist, but they're not the same thing. Don't move faster than you can afford to move back from. I'm aware that last one sounds like something you'd put on a motivational poster. I don't care. It's true. By month 4, I'd looked at property laws. I learned that as a foreigner, you cannot own land in the Philippines. Full stop, no exceptions. You can own a condominium unit, but land? No. The workaround most men used was putting property in their partner's name, which the forum had a blunt collective opinion about. I noted that too. I'd looked at visa options. Tourist visa was 30 days, extendable. See, the SRRV, the Special Resident Retirees Visa, required a deposit of $10,000 minimum, which sat in a Philippine bank and wasn't exactly accessible. I wasn't ready to commit to anything like that yet. I was just reading. In month 4, a Tuesday evening, I typed my first post. I kept it short. Thinking of visiting Cebu for 3 weeks in March. Any advice for a first-timer who doesn't want to do anything stupid? That last part was deliberate. One wanted people to know I'd done some reading, that I wasn't arriving with my eyes shut and my wallet open. The post got a handful of replies. Most were fine: accommodation suggestions, area recommendations, the standard warnings about the tourist bars along Mango Avenue. One reply was longer than the others. It was from a man who called himself Ferg_Limerick on the forum, which caught my eye for obvious reasons. He said he'd been in Cebu 6 years, that he was originally from Limerick City, that he was happy to meet for a coffee if I made it over and answer any questions I had. He said, and I remember this because it was an unusual thing to say on a forum full of warnings, I'm not going to tell you it's all terrible or all wonderful. It's neither. Come and see for yourself. Just go slowly. I booked the flights the following Saturday. Aer Lingus to Dubai, Emirates to Manila, Cebu Pacific down to Mactan. The whole thing cost about €780 return, which was less than I'd expected and more than I'd spent on anything recreational in about 3 years. I booked a serviced apartment near IT Park. Not a hotel, the forum had been clear on that. Hotels made you look like a tourist, and I wasn't trying to look like anything. For 28,000 pesos for 3 weeks, roughly €450. Modest. Clean. I wasn't there for luxury. I told my daughter I was going on a holiday. She said, "Where?" I said, "The Philippines." There was a pause on the phone that I recognized as her trying to decide how to phrase the next question. She said, "Is this because of the divorce, Dad?" I said I supposed it was partly yes. She said, "Okay, just be careful." I said I intended to be. That was the most we said about it. We're not a family that goes in for long discussions about feelings. She got that from me, for better or worse, probably both. I landed in Cebu on a Wednesday morning in March. The heat when I stepped out of Mactan Airport. I wasn't prepared for it. Not the temperature exactly. It wasn't so different from a warm summer day, but the weight of it, the density. The air had a thickness to it that the Irish air absolutely does not have. And the noise. Tricycles, jeepneys, horns, someone playing music from a phone somewhere nearby. And underneath all of it, this low, continuous hum of a city that had been awake for hours before I arrived and didn't need me to orient itself. I stood there with my bag for a moment. Then I got a grab to the apartment, and I started paying attention. Fergal was waiting outside a small cafe near the Ayala Center on day 2. Not inside, outside, under the awning, with a coffee already in front of him, and another one apparently on its way for me. He was around 70, lean, with the kind of tan you get from years rather than holidays. And he looked like a man who'd made his peace with something a long time ago, and stopped thinking about it. We shook hands. He said, "You must be Brendan." I said I must be. We sat down. He didn't do the thing I'd half expected, which was launch immediately into warnings and horror stories. He just asked about my flight, whether I'd managed to sleep, what I thought of the heat. Normal things. We drank our coffee. The cafe had ceiling fans going, and they were doing roughly nothing about the temperature but making a valiant effort. Outside, a jeepney went past, painted with the face of someone I didn't recognize, and the words "blessed" on the front, in large letters. I found out later that most of them say something like that. After a while, Fergal asked what I already knew. I told him about the forum, about the 4 months of reading, about the notes I'd kept. He nodded as I went through it. When I mentioned the land ownership rules, he said, "Good, that's the main one." When I mentioned the allowance escalation patterns, he said, "That's the second main one." When I mentioned the multiple boyfriend thing, he said, "Third main one," and he actually smiled slightly, in the way you smile at something that's both funny and genuinely terrible. He said he'd known men who'd walked into every single one of those situations within the first 6 months. Good men, some of them. Not stupid men. Just men who'd arrived lonely and had confused speed with sincerity. That phrase stayed with me. Confused speed with sincerity. I wrote it in the notebook that evening. He talked about his own situation, his wife, a woman from Bohol named Cora, how they'd met through a school where he was teaching English, how her family had initially assumed he was rich, in the way Filipinos sometimes assume all Westerners are rich, and how that assumption had required careful, patient correction. He didn't describe it as a problem exactly, more as a thing that had needed tending to, regularly, until it wasn't a thing anymore. He said the family obligation aspect of Filipino culture was real and genuine, and not something to be cynical about. Supporting your parents, your siblings, your extended family, that's not manipulation, that's just how it works here. But that there was a difference between engaging with it honestly and being quietly enrolled in it without your knowledge or consent. I asked him what the difference looked like in practice. He thought about it. He said, "The difference is whether she tells you about it before you ask, and whether she'd still be there if you said no." I thought that was a useful way to think about things. I wrote that down too. The first week I did almost nothing except walk and eat and observe. I had no agenda. I had 3 weeks and nowhere to be, and, for the first time in years, no particular role to perform. Not the reliable husband, not the factory floor worker, not the man the town felt sorry for. Just a large, quiet Irishman eating takalog for breakfast at a carinderia near the apartment and watching the street wake up. The food, I'll say, was better than I'd expected. I'd been warned it was very different from what I was used to, and it is, but different in a way that suits me. Rice with everything. Pork cooked in ways I hadn't encountered before. Sinigang, which is a sour soup that I had no frame of reference for, and then had 3 times in the first week. I'm not a man who eats adventurously, generally, but I've also spent 30 years eating canteen sandwiches, and I was perhaps more open to novelty than I'd realized. I didn't go to the bars along Mango Avenue. Fergal had mentioned them in a tone that made the mention itself a sufficient warning. I didn't join the expat pub circuit. I gathered there was one, there always is, and I gathered it consisted largely of men swapping the same stories in rotation, and I'd heard enough stories for the time being. I walked the same streets repeatedly, down past the Gaisano Country Mall, through the IT Park area in the evenings when it was slightly cooler and people were out, all along the side streets where the sari-sari stores had tables and chairs outside, and the television was always on. I bought things from those stores and said salamat, and felt mildly pleased with myself each time. A low bar for cultural integration, I'm aware. But somewhere to start. The second week, on a Sunday, Fergal invited me to lunch. It was at someone's house, a friend of his wife Cora's, a woman named Divina, who made enough food for about 12 people, and only 8 arrived. That's another thing about Filipino hospitality I'd have no frame of reference for. The scale of it. You don't cook for the people coming. You cook until you've run out of space on the table. There were 4 or 5 of us from outside the Philippines, and a few Filipino friends and family members of the host. Here I ended up sitting next to a woman who was introduced to me simply as May. She was 39, though I only learned that later. She had a specific, precise way of talking. Not formal exactly, but considered. Like she chose words because they were accurate rather than because they were pleasing. She was working remotely, she told me, as a medical transcriptionist for a clinic in California. She'd been doing it 4 years. She worked the night shift Philippine time, which meant she slept odd hours and was often awake at the times the rest of the household wasn't. I asked her what medical transcription involved because I genuinely didn't know. She explained it. I told her about the pharmaceutical packaging plant. She asked a question about the process that suggested she'd actually been listening rather than waiting for her turn to speak. So I asked a question back. We talked about work for probably 40 minutes. It occurs to me now that I've described this conversation to several people since, and they all find it slightly strange that 2 people who would eventually end up living together spent their first conversation discussing shift patterns and transcription software. But I didn't find it strange at the time. I found it restful, I suppose. Nobody was performing anything. She wasn't trying to impress me. I wasn't trying to impress her. We were just two people who had jobs, talking about having jobs. She didn't flirt. I didn't flirt. Neither of us had the energy for it, or maybe neither of us saw the point yet. We ate. There was lechon at the center of the table, a whole roasted pig, which I'd read about, but not yet encountered, and lumpia and rice and several dishes I couldn't name but ate anyway. Someone opened San Miguel's. I had one. See, May didn't drink, which I noted without comment. At the end of the afternoon, we exchanged WhatsApp numbers because Fergal suggested we might as well. May said she sometimes recommended good places to eat if people were new to Cebu and didn't know where to go. I said that would be useful. We said goodbye. I walked back to the apartment. The evening was warm and someone 2 streets over was doing karaoke with considerable enthusiasm and limited accuracy. I sat on the small balcony and thought about nothing in particular for about an hour. Then I went inside and added one more line to the notebook. It just said, May, medical transcription, Cebu, sensible. I didn't know what I meant by that last word exactly. I just knew it was the right one. I flew back to Limerick in the last week of March. Same journey in reverse. Cebu Pacific to Manila, to 12 hours to Dubai, then home. I landed at Shannon in the early morning, gray and drizzling in the way that Shannon Airport does as a matter of professional obligation, and got a taxi back to the house. The house felt the same. Of course it did. 3 weeks away doesn't change a house, but I felt slightly different in it, which amounts to the same thing, I suppose. I put the kettle on. I unpacked. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked out at the back garden, which needed attention, and thought about very little in a focused sort of way. May had sent a WhatsApp message the previous evening. It just said, "Safe travels. Hope the sinigang was worth the flight." I replied, "It was, actually." That was the beginning. We didn't call it anything. I want to make that clear because I think people expect some declaration, some moment where it becomes official. There wasn't one. We just started talking and kept talking, and at some point the talking became a feature of each day rather than an occasional thing. The first few weeks it was a few times a week. A voice message from her in the evening my time, which was early morning hers before she started her shift. Sometimes just a link to something. A news story, a video, something she thought was interesting. I'd reply, she'd reply back. It had the rhythm of correspondence more than conversation, which suited both of us, I think. By May, it was most days. Video calls on Sundays, which we didn't discuss or arrange, it just settled into being the pattern. So she'd be in her kitchen in the apartment she rented near IT Park. I recognized the area from my walks, with a coffee, and her hair still slightly damp from the shower. I'd be in my kitchen in Limerick with tea and the garden visible through the window. We talked about the same things we'd talked about at Davina's table. Her work deadlines, my garden, which I'd started actually attending to, Irish weather, complained about at length and with specific examples. She asked about my daughter early on. Not just once, she came back to it, asked how she was getting on, remembered details from what I'd said the previous time. I noticed this. I'd become, after 31 years of quality control, and about 14 months of being made a fool of in my own marriage, to quite attentive to the difference between someone asking questions because they're interested and someone asking questions because it's the correct thing to do. The rhythm of it felt genuine, but I kept watching. I told her a bit about the divorce. Not everything, not the particular embarrassment of the town knowing, but the shape of it. She listened without offering anything excessive in response. "No, you poor thing. No, how awful for you." Just listened. Then she said, "I understand more than you might think," and didn't elaborate further, and I didn't push. I found out over the following weeks, in pieces, that she'd been in a long relationship that had ended badly. A Filipino man, several years ago. She didn't give me details I hadn't asked for, and I didn't ask for details she hadn't offered. We were, it turned out, to two people who'd had the experience of thinking they knew someone and discovering the file was incomplete. June, she told me about her family, not as a request. I want to be clear about that because I've thought about it a lot since. It wasn't, "I need you to know this before I ask you for something." It was more like she was describing her week, and her week included a call with her mother in Bohol, and the call with her mother had involved a worry about the roof, and a worry about her father's blood pressure. And she just told me, plainly, the way you tell someone about your day. She said, "My family's situation is complicated. My parents are old and not well. My brother-in-law has ideas that cost money he doesn't have. There are 4 siblings, and I'm the only one with a reliable income, which means I carry more than my share of things. This is just how it is. I'm not telling you because I want you to do anything about it. I'm telling you because I don't want you to find out later and wonder why I didn't say." I sat with that for a moment. I remember I was eating leftover pasta. Odd detail, but there it is. I said, "I appreciate you telling me." She said, "I'm not asking you for anything, but I won't pretend my life is simpler than it is." I've tried to explain to people since why that conversation mattered so much, and I'm not sure I do it justice. But the forum had been full of stories about men who'd been told a version of someone's life rather than the actual version, and found out the difference at considerable expense. May was doing the opposite. She was handing me the full picture before I'd asked to see it. And she was doing it at a point where I hadn't sent her a single peso, and she had no financial reason to manage my impressions. You can't fake that, or if you can, it requires a level of strategic patience that I frankly respect more than it concerns me. I didn't send money during that whole period. 6 months, not a euro. She didn't ask. I want to say again that this wasn't a test I'd consciously constructed. It was just, I knew from the forum that the asking pattern, once established, compounds. I was in no hurry to establish it. But there's something else I'll tell you, because it's true and slightly unflattering. Part of my not sending money was also that I didn't quite know what we were yet, and I didn't want the answer to that question to get entangled with a financial arrangement. I wasn't ready to commit to anything. And I was a 62-year-old man from Limerick who'd had his life rearranged without his input. And I was being cautious, not only because the forum told me to, but because caution was, at that point, all I reliably had. The calls moved to most evenings by August. We talked longer. Less about work. More about everything else. She told me about growing up in Bohol, her parents' house, the street, the church they went to every Sunday, as a matter of absolute fact rather than preference. She was genuinely devout, or at least genuinely Catholic, which in the Philippines is sometimes the same thing, and sometimes a more complicated relationship with the institution. She lit a candle for her father's health. She asked me once if I was religious, and I said I was raised Catholic, in the way most people my age in Limerick were raised Catholic. Which is to say thoroughly, and with diminishing returns. She laughed at that. It was a good laugh. Comfortable. By October I'd booked another flight. She knew I was coming. We'd talked about it. I'd be in Cebu for 5 weeks this time. Longer, to get a proper sense of things rather than the tourist version of a sense of things. And for the second week, we were going to take the ferry across to Bohol. To meet her family. I remember my daughter called me the night before I flew. She asked how things were going. I said fine. She said, "Are you seeing that woman again?" I said I supposed I was. There was a pause. She said, "Okay, be careful." I said, "I know, you've said that." She said, "I know I've said it. I'm saying it again." I said, "I will." And this time, I actually had a specific plan for what that looked like. The ferry from Cebu to Tagbilaran takes about 2 hours. We sat on the upper deck. May had a coffee from the little stand near the gangway, and I had one too, though it wasn't very good. The sea was flat, and a deep green blue that doesn't exist in the Atlantic. I watched Cebu get smaller behind us, and Bohol come up slowly ahead, and thought about the fact that I was 62 years old, and doing something I'd never done, and wasn't sure I could name. May was quiet on the crossing. Not withdrawn, just settled. She had her phone out, but wasn't really looking at it. At some point she said, "My parents are not very modern people." I said, "Nor am I." She considered this. She said, "They will be polite to you. They won't know quite what to make of you." I said that was fine. She said, "My father may not look at you directly for the first day. And that's not rudeness. He doesn't know the protocol for this." I said I understood. She looked at me for a moment, and I think she was checking whether I actually did or was just saying so. I must have passed whatever the check was, because she nodded and looked back at the water. The house was about 20 minutes from the port by tricycle. It was a concrete block house painted a pale yellow that had faded unevenly, with a corrugated roof that I could see from the road had 2 sections where the panels didn't quite sit flush. A mango tree in the front. A basketball hoop at the side. No net. The usual sorry store attached to the corner of the house. A small window with metal bars and a hand-lettered sign above it. Half the houses in the Philippines have one. I'd noticed that in Cebu. May's mother came out before we reached the door. Small woman, 60s, wearing a floral duster. She held May's face in her hands for a moment and said something in Cebuano I didn't catch. Then she looked at me. She said, "Welcome, Po. I'm very formally." I said thank you. I was glad to be there. She nodded and went back inside, and we followed. Her father was seated in the main room in a plastic chair near the window. He had the look of a man who had once been larger and had diminished somewhat over the years. He stood when we came in, which I appreciated the effort of. He shook my hand without quite meeting my eyes, as May had said he wouldn't. I was the same. We had that in common at least. There were sisters, 2 of them present, both with children who ran through the house in the random, undirected way that children do when there are enough of them. I couldn't immediately sort out whose children belonged to whom. May introduced me around with a patience and specificity I noticed but didn't comment on. But the food appeared in quantities that seemed designed for a considerably larger gathering. Rice, naturally. Adobo, which I'd learned to eat properly by now. Something made with coconut milk that I couldn't identify but was excellent. Bangus, which is milkfish, grilled, bones left in, which requires a certain technique I'm still developing. I ate what I was given without complaint. May's mother watched me eat, with what I interpreted as cautious approval. I'd been told by Fergal that eating whatever you're given, and eating it with evident appreciation, goes a long way. He was right. Nobody asked me for anything that day. I want to note that clearly because I'd been reading about the Kano boyfriend who arrives and immediately becomes the subject of a series of carefully sequenced requests. It didn't happen, and the family was hospitable and somewhat formal and genuinely uncertain how to treat me, which is how I'd expect any reasonable family to treat a stranger who has appeared from Ireland with their unmarried daughter. The brother-in-law came up on day 3. He was May's sister's husband, a man in his early 40s with the particular energy of someone whose ideas have always been slightly better in concept than in practice. He mentioned the sari-sari store idea, in the way you float a thing to see whether it floats. Conversationally, without directing it specifically at me, he said he'd been looking into expanding, that there was an opportunity in the barangay, that capital was the only limiting factor. I listened. I didn't respond directly. May, who was sitting beside me, who said something in Cebuano that had the tone of a door being firmly but quietly closed. The subject moved on. I watched how May handled it. She didn't embarrass him. She didn't appeal to me or make me the reason for the no. She just redirected, smoothly, in a way that preserved everyone's dignity, including mine. It was competent in a way I found reassuring. She'd been managing her family's expectations of her for years before I arrived, and she was still managing them now. My presence hadn't changed the dynamic so much as added one more variable she was accounting for. On the fourth day, I asked May, privately, what the roof would cost to fix. We were walking near the water, away from the house. She'd mentioned it months earlier on one of our calls, and I'd been thinking about it since I'd seen the panels for myself. She told me around 110,000 pesos to do it properly. About 1,800 euros to 2,000 euros, depending on materials. She said this in the same tone she used to quote her transcription rates. Just a number, not a request. I sat with it for about 24 hours. I did the calculation against the pension. I thought about what I was prepared to offer and what I expected in return, which was nothing. I thought about how to say it in a way that was clear without being clinical. The following morning I said to May, I'd like to contribute to the roof. I can send 110,000 pesos when I'm back in Cebu. This is a one-time thing. I'm not establishing a pattern of contributions, and I'm not expecting anything for it. Does that work for you? I remember she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You don't have to do that. I said, I know. That's why I'm doing it. She cried, and not dramatically. Just went quiet, and then there were tears, and she turned away slightly, which I think was embarrassment more than anything else, and said, sorry. I said there was nothing to apologize for. She composed herself quickly. She has a kind of self-possession that I've come to understand is not coldness. It's something else. A preference for not being seen in certain moments. She said, My family will try to make you feel like a blessing. You're not a blessing. You're a person doing a kind thing. Those are different. I said, I know the difference too. She nodded. That was the end of the conversation. I transferred the money through Wise when we got back to Cebu. 110,000 pesos, which landed at about 1,800 euros after fees. May forwarded it to her parents. I didn't ask for updates or photographs or thanks. It was a roof. I'd said what it was. It didn't need to be more than that. I want to tell you about the pressures of year 2. Not because they make for a dramatic story. They don't, particularly, but because I think they're actually the most useful part of what one have to say. The dramatic stories are everywhere. The cautionary tales are easy to find. What's harder to find is an account of what the pressure looks like when it arrives, and what it looks like when it doesn't go the way the horror stories say it will. By February of year 2, I'd moved to Cebu properly. Not formally. I was still on an extendable tourist visa, which required a quick border hop every few months, nothing complicated. But I was living there. May and I had found a small house to rent in a quiet street off Nivell Hills, up above the city where it was marginally cooler, and the roosters started at 4 in the morning as a matter of absolute routine. The rent was 22,000 pesos a month, roughly 350 euros, which was comfortable against my pension. I kept the Limerick house. I wasn't ready to sell it. I'm still not sure I ever will be. The first pressure arrived about 3 weeks after I settled in a bar I'd never intended to go to. I wasn't much of a barman in Limerick, and I'm not much of one in Cebu either, but Fergal had suggested a particular place near the waterfront for a quiet beer and a catch-up, and I went. Fergal left early. He had a commitment of some kind. And I stayed for a second San Miguel because I was comfortable and not in a hurry. That's when the British man sat down. I won't give him a name because I don't know it. And he introduced himself, but I've forgotten it, which tells you something. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, twice divorced, he told me within about 4 minutes, with a general manner of someone who has processed both divorces primarily as evidence that women cannot be trusted. He had the look of a man who'd been in Cebu long enough to feel like an authority on it. He went at it for a solid hour. The thesis was straightforward. All Filipino women operate the same way. The roof was the first contribution of many. May was managing me with a sophistication I was too naive to detect, and the fact that I thought things were going well was itself the proof that I was being handled. He presented his own 2 failed relationships in the Philippines as data rather than personal history. He was, I'll give him this, internally consistent. And his argument held together. It was just built entirely on the assumption that his experience was universal, and anyone who disagreed was wrong or not yet wise enough to know they were wrong. I listened. I bought him a beer. I said, "I hear you," and I meant it in the sense that I had in fact heard him, which is different from agreeing with him. I walked home. It took about 20 minutes. The city was warm and lit up, and someone was doing karaoke 2 streets over. A woman's voice, actually quite good, working through something I half recognized. I thought about what he'd said and whether any of it applied. The part about the roof being the first of many was the one worth examining. But I'd been specific about that. One time, not a pattern. May had not since suggested another contribution. 7 months had passed. But the man in that bar was not a warning. He was a mirror. And what he showed me was a version of a life organized entirely around having been hurt, mistaking that injury for insight. I'd met him in Limerick. Different pub, same conviction. The certainty that your misfortune is everyone's future. I walked home and didn't think about it much further. The property question I handled differently. That one required actual steps, rather than just clear thinking. Fergal had given me the name of a Philippine attorney, a woman who worked regularly with foreign nationals, based in a small office near the capital. I made an appointment. I sat across from her for about an hour and a half, and she walked me through the land ownership rules with a specificity that forum posts can't quite replicate. Odd because forum posts don't have professional liability attached to them. The summary was simple. I could not own land, not under any circumstances, not through any arrangement that didn't carry significant legal risk. I could own a condominium unit, but the percentage of foreign-owned units in any building is capped, and the availability varies. The most common workaround, putting property in a partner's name. She described with a neutrality that made its dangers plain without her having to editorialize. She'd seen it go wrong. More than once. May and I discussed our options. We were direct about it, in the way we'd learned to be direct about things. She said, "I'm not going to pretend this is an ideal arrangement for you." I said, "I know. But I also knew what the arrangement was before I came, so I'm not surprised by it." We settled on a long-term lease, a different house than we were renting, slightly larger, better garden. Title in May's name, which is the legal reality, regardless. But I had a formal lease agreement drawn up by the Philippine attorney, and I sent a copy to my solicitor in Limerick, who reviewed it by email and came back with 2 suggested amendments, both of which were incorporated. The total cost across both sides of the legal work was approximately €800. For a document that protects a living arrangement I intend to maintain indefinitely, I consider that reasonable. The cousin's medical bill arrived in April. May told me about it on a Tuesday evening, matter-of-factly. A cousin had been hospitalized. The bill was 45,000 pesos, about €720, and she was going to use her savings to cover it. She wasn't asking me. She was telling me the way she told me things, which was in full, without managing what I knew. I offered to split it. She said no. I didn't push. I noted what had happened and what hadn't happened, and added it to the inventory I'd been keeping since the first week on the forum. The sorry proposal came back in May, more formally this time. The brother-in-law had been thinking, and he'd prepared something closer to an actual pitch. He rang May. She took the call in the other room. I heard her voice for about 10 minutes, steady, patient, and then she came back in and said he'd asked again. I said, "What did you tell him?" She said that it wasn't something we were in a position to do. I said, "We." She said, "Yes, we." I said, "Thank you." She said, "You don't need to thank me for that." And that was it. No argument, no negotiation, no suggestion that I might want to reconsider. She'd said no on our behalf, without being asked, and then came back and told me about it. And I think about that moment sometimes when people ask me how I knew. The no I never had to give. The backing I never had to request. You build a structure, and then you wait to see if it holds. We'd built something careful and slow, with specific conversations and written agreements and a shared understanding of what was reasonable. And when the pressure arrived, which it did, in exactly the forms I'd read about on the forum at 2:30 in the morning in Limerick, the structure held. Not because I was clever. Because we'd both been honest about what we were building and what it was for. So, that's more or less where we are. 2 years on, I live in Cebu, in a house with a garden I didn't expect to care about and do. There's a small lime tree in the corner that I planted last March, and it's doing well. Which is more than I can say for anything I've ever tried to grow in Limerick. May works from the room she uses as an office, the door usually open, the sound of her typing a background presence in the mornings. We eat together in the evenings. We go to the SM Seaside City on Saturdays sometimes, not because either of us particularly wants anything, just because that's a thing we do now. She picks up things from Watson's. I carry the bags. A routine, in other words, which is all I ever really wanted. I go back to Limerick once a year. January, usually. I stay in the house, which I still own, and am still not ready to sell and possibly never will be. I see a few people. I walk the same streets. The Centra is the same. The careful cheerfulness of people who feel sorry for you has, I notice, faded somewhat. Partly because enough time has passed, and partly because I no longer look like someone who needs to be felt sorry for, which helps. My daughter visited in January this year. I was more nervous about that than I admitted to May, and May knew I was more nervous than I was admitting because she knows me fairly well at this point. My daughter she's a particular sort of person, precise, careful, not easy to impress, and not pretending to be. She gets that from me, or I hope she does. She spent 10 days. She and May were polite on the first day, cautiously respectful on the second. And by day 4, they were sitting together in the garden drinking coffee while I was inside doing something else, and I could hear them talking, just the murmur of it through the window, and I thought, right, okay, there we are. My daughter told me before she left that May seemed like a good person. She said it carefully, the way she says things, like it was a considered assessment rather than a compliment. I said, I think so too. She said, okay. And that was the most either of us said about it. From my daughter, That's nearly an endorsement. Now, the money. Because I know that's what people want to know. And I might as well just say it plainly. 2 years of being with May, here's the accounting outside of my own living costs. The roof, 110,000 pesos, which was about 1,800 euros after fees. The legal work, the Philippine attorney and my solicitor in Limerick reviewing the lease, 800 euros in total. 3 separate contributions toward May's parents' medical expenses over the 2 years. Her father's blood pressure medication and a hospital stay, and her mother's eye procedure, totaling 87,000 pesos across all 3 occasions, roughly 1,400 euros. A few hundred euro here and there that falls under any reasonable definition of sharing a life with someone. A flight change fee, a birthday dinner for her sister in Tagbilaran, a new kettle when the old one failed. Added up, about 5,000 euros, over 2 years. In a relationship, I spent more than that on a kitchen renovation in 2016 that my ex-wife designed and I never liked. Gray tiles, she said, were modern. They were cold in winter and showed every mark. I'm not going to tell you the Philippines is paradise. It isn't, particularly. The traffic in Cebu City is a genuine ordeal. The humidity in August is something I'm still not fully at peace with. The visa situation requires attention. I do a border run to Hong Kong every year to reset things. To end, I'm looking at whether the SRRV makes sense eventually, though the $10,000 deposit sitting in a Philippine bank is a commitment I haven't decided on yet. The property arrangement is what it is. I don't own the house in the legal sense, and I'm an adult who made that choice with full information and a document my solicitor reviewed. That's the reality. I can live with it. What I'll tell you is this, and it's not glamorous, but it's what I actually know to be true. You get out of this what preparation you put in. Same as anything. The men who come here with no understanding of the culture, no knowledge of the legal landscape, no willingness to move slowly, some of them are fine, and some of them lose everything they have. The difference, as far as I can tell, is not luck. It's whether they did the reading first. Read the horror stories. All of them. Not to be put off, but to understand the shapes of the traps. Understand that family obligation here is genuine and real and not automatically manipulation, but also that it can be used as manipulation, and you need to know the difference. The difference, Fergal told me, is whether she tells you about it before you ask, and whether she'd still be there if you said no. Find someone with her own life, with her own income, and her own work, and her own reason to get up in the morning that isn't you. If the entire architecture of her existence depends on your continued financial participation, that's not a relationship. That's a dependency. And dependencies are not comfortable for anyone. Set your limits in conversation, not in resentment. Say plainly what you can do and what you can't, early, before the expectations form. It's much easier to have that conversation before anything is established than after. Get a lawyer, both here and at home. The 800 euros I spent was the best 800 euros in this whole business. A document reviewed by someone with professional liability attached to their name is worth considerably more than a forum post, however well-intentioned. And go slowly. That's the main thing. I spent 4 months reading before I booked a flight. I spent 7 months talking to May before I visited her family. I spent 8 months before I contributed a single euro. That pace felt, at the time, like caution, bordering on cowardice. Looking at it now, it was just correct. It was the right pace for a process I didn't fully understand yet. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years clocking in and clocking out, and I had my life rearranged without my input, by a woman who left me for the man 3 doors down. And I came out, in my measured estimation, ahead. One other thing, the socket wrench, still gone. I've accepted this. Some losses are permanent, and you just have to make your peace with them. That's Brendan's story. And I'll be honest, when we first spoke to him, I wasn't sure we had a story at all. No betrayal, no collapse, no dramatic revelation in the small hours of the morning. Just a quiet, careful man who did the reading, moved slowly, and ended up somewhere he wanted to be. But I think that is the story, the one we don't tell often enough on this channel, because it doesn't have the momentum of a disaster. It doesn't have the kind of tension that keeps people watching. What it has, instead, is the specific list of decisions that made the difference. The 4 months on the forum before the first flight. The introduction through a trusted contact rather than a dating app. The transparency about money, what he had, what he was prepared to offer, what the limits were, stated plainly and early, in conversation rather than in fine print. The legal documentation that his solicitor reviewed, and the partner who, when her brother-in-law came back with his proposal and her cousin needed help and the pressures arrived in the ways they always arrive, said no, on their behalf, without being asked. Not every story here ends in loss. Some of them end in a house off Nivell Hills, with a lime tree in the garden and a woman typing in the next room. That's a real outcome, too. The risk is the same for everyone who comes to the Philippines looking for something different. What Brendan did differently was understand the risk before he took it. Thank you for watching Inside the Philippines. If this story is useful to someone you know, someone who's thinking about making a change, who's been reading the forums at 1:30 in the morning and telling themselves they're just looking, share it with them. Subscribe if you haven't. And read everything before you book anything.